some consideration in connection with preparing a seminar in Cape Town dealing with the challenges of e-learning, not least in the context of the corona crisis. It is a complex field, and it is a complex field especially as it is dealing with an issue that has multiple layers to consider. On the one hand, we have something that is very practical for teachers, for professors, and as well for students. The immediate challenge in the classroom, but at the same time, there is an understanding, a different understanding of what actually learning means. Perhaps it is just something that is activated, mobilized by this crisis, and it is as such not really new. Then we have a political level. Again, here is something that is of immediate concern. What can we do here and now in the different contexts? And then there is the more abstract level. I will start with the latter. And it is not really about the political in the strict sense as we usually understand it, but it is on the political economy of what we actually face as a challenge. Before I go into details, just a general remark. It is about mutual learning. There is nobody really who can say or claim having the experience of what the e-learning, distance learning, or whatever the name is about. It is something that is shaped by technology, of course. And sorry about this now. And it is obviously something of an attitude, of a different way of dealing with the environment in which we teach, learn, but as well in a different way of utilizing what we usually have. Part of it is obviously that we usually would have in our living room, in our offices, the mobile phone switched on. This is now not a home office, but it is now a home classroom. And in the classroom, we obviously disconnect, demobilize the mobile phone. So there are different ways, but it's one of the most important is that we have to look for different experience, bring them together, and there is not one solution that fits all. We have to develop this and adapt it to the concrete situation in which we are. So the first complex I want to look at is the entire change we are facing now in terms of the accumulation regime, the mode of regulation, the life regime, and the mode of living. I try to define them briefly. The accumulation regime is the way in which we make money and which we spend it for reproduction. Now, this is already problematic in the given context because in a context as South Africa, where we are facing a different, completely different context, it is not simply about making money, but it is really about making a living. It reminds me of a little story I may add, sidelining. I had been teaching in Budapest at the Corvinus University, an international master course, and everything went fine. And after one of the sessions, one of the students came to me saying, "This really sounds interesting, but I have difficulties. I'm coming from a country, Bedouin, a nomad, from Bedouins. I'm coming from a completely different background of nomadic people, and what you are teaching is interesting, but cannot be applied to our system." So this is important to keep in mind, and this is not only between these extremes, but it is as well, I know from my experience of having traveled quite a lot within Europe, the EU, it applies there as well. What you apply in Ireland is not valid in France, and so on and so forth. So the life regime presents the fundamental pattern of production and consumption in the perspective of classes and social groups. We should always keep this in mind. We are talking about classes, we are talking about social groups within a society, and this makes a difference of how do they actually produce and reproduce themselves as such, as classes. Then we have the mode of regulation, which can be understood as the framework, the legal, the normative framework, the rail system supporting and limiting the process of accumulation. So you would have social security systems with the necessary payments coming from the different groups. You would have laws regulating employment, and so on and so forth. So this is the mode of regulation. And then we come finally to the mode of living, which is the translation, if you want, of what individuals make out of the life regime, how they deal with a concrete situation, which is important to, not least because it is different as well, different from individual to individual, and this is a complex feature that we have to face, as well as abstract as it sounds here, as well as a context and background of teaching and learning. From where do we come? What do we want to do? And you look at the diplomas and masters and whatsoever you have today and 20 years ago. The MBA, all this didn't exist, even if you go to the very fundamental, broad issues. The diploma, at some stage, the highest stage, if you want, before the doctorate, is now the lowest stage, and you have BAs and MAs. So this is something we have to keep in mind, and this is something where we have to keep in mind as well how to balance these different levels against and with each other. This is a broad framework, and as broad as it is, we should never forget that it links at the same time, at the very same time, to something that happens in front of our eyes, without even that we know, we are aware of it, really aware of it. Let's take the smartphone, at least in the Western societies, in China as well, for which I'm speaking here. It is in many areas just something we use, we are used to it. We don't recognize that it is actually something very new, very advanced technologically, allowing as well certain ways of communication that do not exist in a different context, and that possibly do not make sense in a different context. How to balance this, how to recognize as well, for instance, the regulation that is needed when we come to advanced technologies. This is completely different. Even the terminology is different. What does private sphere mean? So we cannot simply move on and use our old understanding that we have. As I said, it's falling apart. In different societies, we have different patterns, and we have to look for ways of balancing these four dimensions. But as well, we are living, nolens volens, in a global and globalizing society. And I emphasize global and globalizing because on the one hand, it is already global, and on the other hand, this process of globalization did not come to an end. And especially here in Africa, in some cases as well of my country, China, we have a huge disparity between the different groups. And for instance, here in Africa, the infrastructure is in many areas completely non-existent, which is different in other countries where it is run down. For instance, in Germany, in Italy, where the cutbacks of the recent years caused more or less a disaster in terms of the supply of public services, of public infrastructure. So on the one hand, it did never exist. You interrupt the process of development. In the other case, we face now the situation that it existed at some stage, and now we are getting aware of it, what actually the cutbacks mean. Hopefully we are getting aware, we are becoming aware. Some people do, some people still don't get it. In this way, learning or teaching is not so much the matter of transferring knowledge or even worse, transferring information. We are facing a situation where we are actually dealing with the challenge of providing a space or developing a space that makes it possible to use, if you want, general knowledge, adapt it to the local situation, adapted and adaptable to the individual capabilities and needs. Theoretically, it's a complex process, but it is, I think, very easy to grasp if we simply look at the situation and the challenge that learning is a process that should enable people to have a better life, to be more in control of the situation. And this means, of course, to be more in control with others, because it is all about social being, social integration, and never about the individual himself or herself. So we have to think about this, and this is the third level, that learning, teaching is not a commodity. Of course, you can commodify certain aspects, and this is hugely done, is a very important process we face today. But at the same time, this ruins actually the entire process of learning. We are reproducing knowledge, and this knowledge consists of blocks of information that are put together, but it is not knowledge in terms of, if you want, free dealing with a situation. The freedom as insight into necessities is not the idea of this kind of information. The freedom here, in terms of commodified teaching and learning, is the idea of finding a place in the labor market, in the existing economy. This means if we are serious of taking the opportunity, never miss the opportunities given by a crisis, as it says. If we are aiming on making use of this crisis, it is about understanding qualification in a different way. And this is really enabling people to use technology instead of being used by. You can see it in advanced settings. What usually happens, you get a new computer, you get new software, you get a new smartphone. There are so many features that are excellent developments in the light of engineers, but that are not thought through in terms of the users. So you find at certain times specifications. The most trivial example is, for instance, that these smartphones, so-called smartphones, are developed to such an extent that especially older people cannot use them anymore because it's all so tiny that it is difficult to see what is actually going on. And the other thing is the battery power. You have had huge phones, I don't know how many years ago, 20, 30 years ago, little radios. And I mean radios now, they had not been easily put into the pocket. And nowadays they are so small, including the battery is so small, that you need an additional battery because there is so much energy used for stuff we are not even aware of, let alone that we use it, that we need additional electrical power, so an additional external battery. If we manage in our teaching and in our learning to get away from the simple technological and formal aspects and develop the potential that is there to be utilized for our needs, for satisfying our needs in the local context, then I think we reached, on the one hand, a completely different way of teaching and learning, and a different understanding of knowledge. Now, this means e-learning should not be about presentations as I do them now. They may be still a small part, a relatively small part of the overall teaching, but it is about challenging students in their local context, defining their needs. So it is about the question, not the answer. First the question and then comes the answer. And then it is about having the question, having the local needs, to define them in the context of the given potentials. What can people do? Are they able to do what is needed? How does it link to the global market, to the global economy? It is not simply including these economies or these economic activities in the long chains, but it is about developing different dimensions of self-determined economic activities. Part of it is, of course, in formal ways about cooperatives and fair trade, which is not only fair trade in terms of being paid a just income, but it is about being able to determine what the production is about, how we produce, and it is about the different ways of co-determination. On the one hand, co-determination within such settings as cooperatives, but as well the co-determination of contracts in the international or on the international markets. And I want to come to one concluding point from here now. In a way, going back to the first global framing I provided, many of the problems today in the so-called developing world are made by the exploitation of the so-called developed world. We have had colonialism, we have had imperialism, we have had neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, and you name it. The hegemonic problem, the hegemonic constellation is at the moment still not in favor of the so-called developing world. So it is as well, not least about the political movement coming from here, coming from new processes of learning, to challenge this system. Within the EU, you have currently, in the context of Corona, the debate not only on EU bonds, but as well on Corona bonds, supporting other member states, the weaker economies within the EU. I think there is no way of limiting the discussion on this. Europe claims to have global responsibility, which means as well get Corona bonds globally. Look at the debt situation of the so-called developing countries and work on this. There are different ways, and as well look at different ways of distribution of income. It is in different circles with different models discussed to have a basic income, unconditional. It reaches from the very left to conservative groups. It reaches from very rational economic models to discussions in the Catholic Church, for instance. And this has to be seen as a focus of process of learning and teaching in a globalized and globalizing world. Not just as a matter of justice as a voluntary, merciful relationship, but as a matter of fundamental human rights, which always have to be social rights and always have to be about social security systems that have to be built in this system that allow people to claim their rights within a certain context where you have people, groups, institutions that have to accept their responsibility.